Few names struck more fear in outlaws' hearts during the wild years after the Civil War than Smoking Gun Wilson, the infamous Carson twins, Steel Eye McGraw, and the dreaded Santos brothers. But perhaps none left a more bone-chilling legacy than Michael "Lightning" Kane, a quiet rancher turned vengeance dealer who was credited with outdrawing 23 of the deadliest guns in the territory. A man who once calmly stated, "I didn't choose to be fast with a gun. Fate made that choice for me the day they killed my brother." Join me today as we delve into the story of the man they called Lightning, the silent guardian of Thunder Valley, who proved that the deadliest strike comes not from the loudest storm, but from the quiet sky you never thought to fear. Before we begin, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something extra special lined up for you. Thunder Valley, Texas Territory, summer of 1875. The town was like many others, sprouting up across the untamed frontier, a dusty main street lined with weather-beaten buildings where desperation and hope traded places daily beneath the scorching Texas sun. But unlike the booming silver towns of Colorado or the cattle drives of Kansas, Thunder Valley had remained remarkably peaceful, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the territory where the railroad had yet to reach. It was the kind of place most folks passed through without a second glance, which is exactly why Michael Kane chose it. He rode in on a sweltering June morning, leading a tired Mustang loaded with ranching supplies. The few who witnessed his arrival would later recall two things: the peculiar pearl-handled Remington .44, worn high on his right hip, and the fact that his voice never seemed to rise above a whisper when he asked directions to the land office. His black duster, despite the summer heat, hung perfectly still around him, as if even the wind knew better than to disturb his presence. Sarah Martinez, who ran the land office with her aging father, remembered how Kane's calloused hands handled the paperwork with unexpected gentleness. There was something about his eyes, she would later tell the town's newspaper editor, like still water running deep. The kind of eyes that had seen things best, left buried in the past. He paid for the old Thompson Ranch in gold double eagles, each coin carefully counted out, their dates all from before the war. The townspeople of Thunder Valley were accustomed to drifters and dreamers passing through, each carrying their own whispered stories and hidden burdens. But something about Kane was different. He moved with a fluid grace that some mistook for wariness, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in a frontier boom town. Even the most hardened cowboys, men who'd faced down rustlers and raiders, found themselves instinctively stepping aside when he passed. Sheriff James Cooper, a veteran of both the war and the frontier, watched the newcomer from the shade of his office porch. 20 years of wearing a badge had taught him to read men like wanted posters, and something about Kane's bearing spoke of more than just another would-be rancher seeking a fresh start. That evening, Cooper made a careful entry in his journal. Two kinds of quiet men walk these territories, those who've got nothing worth saying and those who've seen too much to speak of it. This Kane fellow strikes me as the latter. Within days, Kane had settled into the old Thompson place, a sprawling ranch that had lain fallow since its previous owner disappeared during the winter. He worked from sunrise to sunset, mending fences, clearing fields, and rebuilding the weathered barn. Those who passed by noted how he always kept that pearl-handled Remington close, even while driving fence posts or breaking ground for a garden. Maria Flores, the owner of the general store, was perhaps the first to glimpse beneath Kane's quiet exterior. Once a week, he'd come to town for supplies, his lists always precise and his payments always exact. He had a way about him, she'd later recall, like a mountain lion wearing rancher's clothes, all grace and control. But you just knew, there was something deadly underneath. The local saloon crowd tried to draw him out at first, as they did with all newcomers. Bill Hawkins, a loud-mouthed drover who'd had more whiskey than sense, once tried to provoke Kane into a fight. "What's wrong, friend?" he'd sneered, deliberately bumping into Kane's table. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just yellow under all that quiet?" The silence that followed felt heavier than a summer storm. Kane didn't rise, didn't reach for his gun, just looked up at Hawkins with those still, deep eyes. Something in that gaze made the drover step back, his face suddenly pale. I meant no offense," Hawkins stammered, backing away. He rode out of town the next morning, telling anyone who'd listened that he'd seen death itself in those quiet eyes. What no one in Thunder Valley knew, not yet, was that their peaceful corner of the territory had drawn attention from men whose appetites for violence and power would soon shatter their tranquil existence. The Blackwood gang, led by the notorious Mason Blackwood and his 3 ruthless brothers, had been watching the town from afar, seeing it as ripe territory for expansion. They had no way of knowing that the quiet rancher they would soon mock was the very man who had already sent 23 of the West's deadliest gunmen to their graves. The stage was set, and Thunder Valley was about to learn why lightning strikes hardest from the quietest sky. Within a week of Kane's arrival at the Thompson Ranch, subtle changes began rippling through Thunder Valley like waves across still water. The quiet rancher had a way of appearing exactly where and when he was needed, though few could say they'd actually seen him coming or going. It was as if he moved with the shadows themselves, present one moment and gone the next, leaving only whispered stories in his wake. Dr. Thomas Bennett was the first to glimpse beneath Kane's carefully maintained facade. The aging physician had been called out to the ranch one evening to treat what Kane described as a minor injury from ranch work. What the doctor found instead was a bullet graze along the rancher's ribs, fresh enough to still be bleeding. "Peculiar sort of ranch accident," Bennett noted dryly as he cleaned the wound. Kane's only response was a slight smile that never reached his eyes. But it was what the doctor saw next that truly gave him pause. The tapestry of old scars that covered Kane's torso told a story no simple rancher should have lived to tell. Bullet wounds, knife marks, and the distinctive pattern of shotgun pepper spoke of a life filled with the kind of violence that most men wouldn't survive once, let alone repeatedly. "I've treated my share of ranch hands and cowboys," Bennett would later confide to Sheriff Cooper, "but those weren't the scars of a man who tangles with cattle. Those were the marks of someone who's danced with death so many times they're on a first-name basis." Kane's weekly trips into town became something of a ritual that the townspeople could set their watches by. Every Thursday morning, precisely at 9, he would appear at Maria Flores's general store. His shopping list never varied: ammunition for his Remington coffee, basic supplies, and always a handful of penny candies, which he would quietly distribute to any children he passed on his way back to his horse. Sarah Martinez, whose land office window offered a clear view of the street, began to notice other patterns. "He always positioned himself with his back to a wall," she observed in her personal diary, "always kept the street in view. The kind of habits a man doesn't pick up pushing cattle or mending fences." The ranch itself underwent a transformation that seemed to defy the laws of time and physical limitation. Working alone, Kane somehow managed to rebuild the barn, repair 3 miles of fence, and establish a small but thriving herd of cattle in less than a month. More curious still were the modifications that more observant visitors noticed. Clear lines of sight from the house to all approaches, strategically placed mirrors that caught the sunlight in ways that illuminated blind spots, and an elaborate system of bells strung along the property's perimeter that would sound at the slightest disturbance. "Man's either the most paranoid rancher I've ever seen," Deputy William Taylor remarked to Sheriff Cooper, "or he's expecting the kind of trouble that doesn't usually find its way to Thunder Valley." Cooper, who had taken to watching Kane with the patience of a man who'd learned the hard way that quiet waters often ran deadly deep, merely nodded. 20 years of lawkeeping had taught him that men who went to such lengths to prepare for trouble usually had good reason to expect it. The first real hint of Kane's true nature came during a late summer evening at the Silver Dollar Saloon. A group of trail hands, flush with pay and deep in their cups, had taken to harassing Mary Chen, whose father ran the town's laundry. Kane had been sitting quietly in his usual corner, nursing the same glass of whiskey he'd ordered an hour earlier, when one of the cowboys grabbed Mary's arm. What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence of events. One moment Kane was seated in the shadows, the next he stood between Mary and her tormentor. He hadn't drawn his pearl-handled Remington, hadn't made any aggressive moves at all, but something in his stance, in the deadly stillness of his presence, made every man in the saloon reach instinctively for their guns. "The lady," Kane said in that quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "is not interested in your company." The cowboy, too drunk to recognize the death in Kane's eyes, started to reach for his gun. Before his fingers could even brush leather, Kane's hand moved, not to his own weapon, but to the cowboy's wrist. What followed was a lesson in the kind of speed that most men only heard about in legend. The cowboy's gun cleared leather, only to find itself disassembled, its pieces scattered across the floor, its owner staring in disbelief at hands that couldn't quite understand how they'd been outmaneuvered. "Time to ride on," Kane suggested softly. The cowboys, suddenly sober, didn't need to be told twice. After they'd gone, Piano Jack, an old-timer who'd played in saloons from San Antonio to Dodge City, stared at Kane with newfound recognition. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his weathered hands trembling slightly on his glass. "I saw hands move like that once before, 7 years ago in Abilene." But before he could finish his thought, Kane had already melted back into the shadows, leaving only questions and whispered speculation in his wake. The incident fueled a fresh round of rumors about the quiet rancher's true identity, but like all previous attempts to unravel his mystery, these too found no purchase in fact. What no one in Thunder Valley yet realized was that this small demonstration was merely a ripple before the storm. The Blackwood gang, watching through their network of informants, saw it differently. To them, Kane's display of skill wasn't a warning, it was a challenge. And the Blackwoods had never been known to leave a challenge unanswered. Mason Blackwood, upon hearing the report, merely smiled that cold smile that had preceded so many men's deaths. "Seems like our quiet friend is more interesting than we thought," he mused, running a whetstone along his favorite knife. "Perhaps it's time we paid Thunder Valley a proper visit." The wheels of fate had begun to turn, and Thunder Valley's peaceful existence hung in the balance, suspended between a quiet rancher's desire for peace and a violent past that refused to stay buried. The revelation of Michael Kane's true identity came not with a gunshot's bang, but with a wanderer's whisper. Marcus Reed rode into Thunder Valley on a cool September morning, his U.S. Marshal's badge catching the early light. At first glance, he was just another lawman passing through, until he caught sight of Kane leaving the general store. Reed's reaction was immediate and visceral. The veteran marshal, known throughout 3 territories for his unshakable nerve, nearly fell from his horse. His face went pale as fresh linen, and his hand instinctively moved toward his gun before freezing halfway. "Sweet mother of mercy," he breathed, drawing Sheriff Cooper's immediate attention, the lightning still alive. Cooper, who'd been sharing his morning coffee with the marshal on the jail's porch, nearly choked. "The lightning? You don't mean—" "Michael Lightning Kane," Reed confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the name too loudly might summon its owner. "Fastest gun in the Kansas Territory before the Madison County War. They said he could draw and fire 6 shots before a dropped coin hit the ground." The sheriff's office quickly became an impromptu conference room as Reed shared what he knew, 7 years ago, Kane had been a legend in the making, a lawman whose speed with a gun was matched only by his dedication to justice. His reputation grew with each outlaw he brought to justice, earning him the nickname Lightning for his impossibly fast draw. But it wasn't just that he was fast, Reed explained, pacing the small office. He was precise, surgical, could shoot a gun out of a man's hand at 20 paces or put a bullet through his heart, whichever the situation called for. Never saw anyone who could match him. Then came the Madison County War. Not a war in the traditional sense, but a bloody feud between cattle barons that spiraled into open warfare. Kane and his younger brother Thomas, also a lawman, had tried to keep the peace, but one side, the notorious Fuller clan, decided to send a message. They caught Thomas alone at his ranch, Reed continued, his voice growing heavy. Tortured him for hours before killing him. Some say they wanted information about cattle movements. Others say they just wanted to draw his brother out. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Michael Kane, the measured lawman who always gave men a chance to surrender, disappeared. In his place emerged something else, a force of nature that tore through the Fuller clan like a storm through summer wheat. 23 men, Reed said, shaking his head. That's how many he killed in 2 months. Every single person involved in his brother's death, from the triggermen to the ones who just stood watch. He found them all, no matter where they ran. Each one died with lightning in their eyes. Cooper sat heavily in his chair, pieces falling into place, and after just vanished. Some said he died in a shootout in Colorado. Others claimed he'd hung up his guns and disappeared into Mexico. Nobody really knew. Reed moved to the window, watching Kane's retreating figure. Until now. The news spread through Thunder Valley like wildfire, though few dared speak of it above a whisper. The quiet rancher who'd settled among them wasn't just any gunslinger, he was Lightning Kane, the man who'd become a legend and then a ghost. Sarah Martinez found herself reviewing the land purchase documents with new eyes. The gold coins Kane had used to buy the Thompson Ranch, they'd all been dated before the Madison County War, as if they'd been stored away, waiting for the day he'd need a fresh start. Dr. Bennett's medical observations took on new significance. The scar pattern, he explained to Cooper later that day, it tells a story. The older ones, they're from face-to-face fights, the kind a lawman gets in the line of duty. But the newer ones, they're different. Those are the marks of someone who's been hunted, someone who's learned to fight from the shadows. Piano Jack, finally completing his interrupted thought from weeks before, added another piece to the puzzle. Saw him in Abilene 7 years back, the old pianist revealed over whiskey. Right after the Madison County business. He walked into a saloon where 3 of Fuller's men were hiding, didn't say a word, didn't make a sound, just lightning and thunder. When it was over, 2 were dead, 1 was wounded, and Kane hadn't even messed up his coat. But it was Maria Flores who perhaps understood best what the revelation meant. He didn't come here to hide, she told Sarah Martinez as they watched Kane's weekly supply run. Men like him, they don't hide. They wait, like a storm gathering on the horizon. She wasn't wrong. The very next day, riders from the north brought news that would prove her right. The Blackwood gang had begun moving south, leaving a trail of robbed banks and burned ranches in their wake. 4 brothers, each deadlier than the last, leading a gang of 20 hardened killers. Mason Blackwood, the eldest, had a reputation for cruel efficiency. James, the second brother, was a sharpshooter who could pick a man off his horse at 300 yards. The twins, Luke and Matthew, were said to be mirror images of evil, moving in perfect coordination during a fight. Kane took the news with his characteristic silence, but those who watched closely noticed changes. His weekly trips to town now included extra ammunition. The mirrors on his ranch were adjusted, sightlines cleared. He spent more time practicing with that pearl-handled Remington, though few could actually see him draw. Just the rapid-fire reports of shots and the ring of bullets finding their marks. "He knows they're coming," Cooper told Reed, who decided to extend his stay in Thunder Valley. "Question is, why isn't he leaving? Man with his history, he could disappear again. Find another quiet town." Reed watched Kane's methodical preparations with knowing eyes. "Because this time he's found something worth fighting for, something worth staking his ground over." The marshal's words would prove prophetic sooner than anyone expected. The Blackwood gang was indeed coming, drawn by the prospect of easy pickings and now enticed by rumors of Lightning Kane's resurrection. They thought they were riding to assert their dominance over a quiet town and mock a legend. They were riding to their reckoning. The Blackwood gang announced their arrival in Thunder Valley with characteristic brutality. They didn't ride straight into town. Men like the Blackwoods preferred to let fear do their work first. 2 outlying farms were hit in the night, their barns burned, cattle scattered. No one was killed, but the message was clear. Protection would come at a price. The first riders from the gang appeared on a Wednesday morning, deliberately choosing the day before Kane's usual supply run. 3 men, led by Luke Blackwood, the younger of the twins. They swaggered into town like they owned it, the silver spurs on their boots singing a song of menace with each step. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Luke Blackwood was everything Michael Kane wasn't, loud, flashy, and eager to demonstrate his power. He and his companions made a show of inspecting each business along Main Street, helping themselves to whatever caught their fancy. When they reached Maria Flores's store, Luke made his move. "Nice place you got here, señorita," he drawled, deliberately knocking goods off her shelves. "Shame if anything were to happen to it. My brothers and I, we offer reasonable rates for protection. Way we see it, that's just good business." Maria stood her ground, her dark eyes flashing with defiance. "I already have all the protection I need." Luke's hand dropped to his gun. "That's so. Would this protection be that quiet rancher everyone's been whispering about? The one some folks are calling Lightning Kane?" He spat on the floor. "Way I heard it, Lightning Kane died years ago. Whoever your friend is, he's just borrowing a dead man's reputation." The bell above the door chimed softly. Michael Kane stood in the doorway, his black duster still dusty from the trail. He hadn't drawn his pearl-handled Remington, hadn't made any aggressive moves. He just stood there, those deep, quiet eyes taking in the scene. "Mr. Kane," Luke's smile turned predatory. "Heard you were particular about your schedule, but here you are, a day early. Come to protect the lady's honor." "The lady doesn't need protection." Kane's voice was soft as distant thunder. "But you might." Something in his tone made Luke's smile falter. Even the most hardened killers develop instincts for danger, and everything about Kane's stillness set those instincts screaming. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the gentle creak of the ceiling fan, turning lazy circles overhead. Luke's hand twitched toward his gun. Before his fingers could even brush leather, Kane's coat rippled. The pearl-handled Remington seemed to materialize in his hand, as if conjured from thin air. No one saw him draw, just the result. "That's the thing about lightning," Kane said quietly, his gun unwavering. "By the time you see it, it's already struck." Luke Blackwood, for all his bravado, was no fool. He'd heard stories of men who'd tried to outdraw Lightning Kane. None of those stories had happy endings. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands. "Just having a friendly business discussion," Luke managed, backing toward the door. "No harm done." "Then ride out," Kane suggested. "Tell your brothers that Thunder Valley isn't interested in their kind of business." They left, trying to maintain their dignity while their instincts screamed at them to run. As soon as they were gone, Maria turned to thank Kane, but he was already moving toward the door. "Bar your windows tonight," he said softly. Keep your shotgun close." Word of the confrontation spread quickly. Sheriff Cooper and Marshal Reed, watching from the jail, knew this was only the beginning. "Mason won't take this lying down," Reed observed grimly. "His whole reputation is built on fear. If one man stands up to them, then others might follow." Cooper finished. "I know. Question is, what's their next move?" They didn't have to wait long for an answer. That night, a rider arrived from the south, his horse lathered and breathing hard. The Blackwood gang's main force had been spotted. 30 men strong, with all 4 brothers leading them. They were riding hard for Thunder Valley. At his ranch, Kane made his preparations with methodical precision. Those who rode past reported seeing him working on his property, setting up defenses that seemed excessive for simple cattle ranching. Marshal Reed, observing through his spyglass, recognized the preparations for what they were. "He's setting up a killing ground," Reed told Cooper, "same way he did during the Madison County War. The Blackwoods think they're riding in to break a legend. Instead, they're walking into a trap." Sarah Martinez, bringing news from the telegraph office, added another piece to the puzzle. "Wires are down to the north and east," she reported. "We're cut off." The stage was set. Thunder Valley held its breath, caught between Lightning Kane's deadly calm and the approaching storm of the Blackwood gang. The legend of Lightning Kane was about to be tested once again, and this time an entire town would bear witness to the truth behind the whispered tales. The Blackwood gang arrived at dawn, their approach heralded by a cloud of dust rising against the purple sky. Mason Blackwood had chosen his moment carefully. Folklore said a man's spirit was weakest at first light, when night's darkness still clung to the world, but morning's strength hadn't yet taken hold. If this story has caught your attention, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The best is yet to come. They came in force, 30 riders spread out in a wide arc, their horses' hooves drumming a war beat against the Texas earth. The 4 Blackwood brothers rode at the center, Mason in his signature black coat, James with his custom Winchester across his saddle, and the twins Luke and Matthew flanking them like mirror images of malice. In town, Sheriff Cooper and Marshal Reed watched their approach from the jail's roof. 30 men, Reed muttered. "Against 1. 2, Cooper corrected, checking his rifle. "I didn't spend 20 years keeping peace in this town to stand aside now." 3, came a voice from below. Quick Draw McGraw, the reformed gunslinger who'd once faced Kane and lived, climbed up to join them. "Man showed me mercy once. Time to repay that debt." But Kane had other plans. As the gang approached the outskirts of Thunder Valley, they found the quiet rancher waiting for them. He sat motionless on his paint horse, that black duster catching the early morning breeze, the pearl-handled Remington resting easily at his side. Mason Blackwood raised his hand, and his riders spread out in a practiced formation. "So," he called out, his voice carrying across the morning stillness, "the ghost of Lightning Kane. Have to admit I expected someone more impressive." Kane's response was characteristically quiet. "Turn back." The simplicity of the statement seemed to amuse Mason. "Turn back? 30 guns against 1, and you're telling us to turn back?" He laughed, the sound echoing off the valley walls. "Maybe you've been out in the sun too long, old man. The Lightning I heard about would have known better than to face these odds." "Not giving you odds," Kane replied softly. "Giving you a chance." Something in his tone made several of the gang members shift uneasily in their saddles. They'd heard stories about the Madison County War, about how Lightning Kane had systematically hunted down 23 men. Some of those stories were now whispering warnings in their minds. Mason Blackwood wasn't so easily deterred. "Luke tells me you're quick, maybe even as quick as the stories say, but being quick won't help you against 30 guns. This is simple arithmetic, Kane. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options." "Numbers don't matter much to Lightning," Kane observed mildly. "It strikes where it wants." The exchange was interrupted by movement from the town. Sheriff Cooper and Marshal Reed were riding out, followed by McGraw and several townspeople who'd found their courage. They took up positions behind Kane, rifles ready. "Looks like the odds just changed a bit," Cooper called out. "Might want to reconsider your arithmetic, Blackwood." Mason's face darkened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The town should have been cowering, not standing up to them. His reputation was built on fear, and fear was rapidly turning to defiance. "Last chance," Kane said into the tension. "Ride out. Find easier pickings elsewhere, or stay and learn why they really called me Lightning." James Blackwood, the sharpshooter, had been studying the terrain through his rifle scope. "Mason," he said quietly, "something's wrong. The ranch, the approaches. He's been preparing for this." "Of course he has," Mason snapped. "He's one man trying to scare 30. It won't work." He raised his voice. "Here's my counteroffer, Kane. Ride out yourself. This town isn't worth dying for. We both know how this ends if you stay." Kane's response was to slowly dismount, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "We do know how this ends. Ask yourself why a man who's killed 23 of the deadliest guns in the territory would choose to face 30 more. The question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Several of the gang members exchanged uncertain glances. They'd signed on to terrorize a town, not face down a legend. And something about Kane's calm certainty was making them reconsider their choices. Mason saw his advantage slipping. "Enough talk," he shouted. "Take him!" 3 men spurred their horses forward, guns clearing leather. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Kane's draw was like its namesake, a flash of movement too fast for the eye to follow. The pearl-handled Remington spoke 3 times, its report sharp in the morning air. 3 riders hit the ground, their guns spinning away, each with a precisely placed wound in their shooting arm. "Not killed, disabled with surgical accuracy. That's 3, Kane said quietly. "Want to try for 23? The remaining gang members suddenly found themselves remembering urgent business elsewhere. Despite Mason's shouted orders, horses began turning, riders began backing away. The legend of Lightning Kane had just proven itself very much alive. Mason Blackwood, watching his fearsome reputation crumble, made his decision. "Kill him!" he roared, drawing his own gun. "Kill them all!" The valley erupted in gunfire, and the real storm was about to begin. The first volley of gunfire turned the peaceful dawn into chaos. Bullets whined through the air like angry hornets, kicking up dust and splintering wood. But Kane was already moving, his black duster seeming to flow like water as he rolled behind a nearby boulder. The pearl-handled Remington spoke twice more in his hand, each shot finding its mark with uncanny precision. 2 more of Blackwood's men fell from their saddles, their guns dropping unfired from wounded hands. Kane wasn't shooting to kill, he was systematically disarming the gang, 1 precise shot at a time. It was a display of skill that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. "Spread out," Mason Blackwood commanded, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "Surround him. No one man can watch every direction." But Kane had been preparing for this moment. As the gang members spurred their horses to encircle his position, hidden triggers around the valley sprang to life. Carefully placed ropes snapped taut, causing horses to stumble. Pre-positioned mirrors suddenly caught the rising sun, blinding riders at crucial moments. The entire valley had become a carefully orchestrated trap. "He's been playing us from the start," James Blackwood realized, watching through his rifle scope as chaos erupted among their men. The ranch, the town, everything, it's all positioned exactly where he wants it. From the town's position, Marshal Reed watched with professional appreciation. "Same tactics he used in Madison County," he told Cooper as they provided covering fire. "He's not just fast with a gun. He's a strategist. Turns the whole battlefield into a weapon." The The twins, Luke and Matthew, tried to coordinate a flanking maneuver, moving in their signature mirror image attack pattern, but Kane seemed to anticipate their every move. A single shot ricocheted off a rock face, the bullet splitting into fragments that scattered both brothers' horses, disrupting their carefully practiced routine. "How?" Luke shouted in frustration. "How can he predict everything?" The answer came from Quick-Draw McGraw, who had positioned himself on a nearby roof. "Because he's fought men like you before," the reformed gunslinger called out. "Fought them and buried them 23 times over." Mason Blackwood, watching his carefully planned assault dissolve into confusion, felt the cold hand of fear for the first time. This wasn't just a gunfight, it was a masterclass in tactical warfare. Kane was using every advantage, the terrain, the light, even his opponent's own tactics against them. The gang's numbers were working against them now. In the confined space of the valley, with Kane's traps limiting their movement, riders got in each other's way. Shots meant for the quiet rancher ended up hitting their own men. The confusion was complete. Through it all, Kane moved like a ghost, appearing and disappearing among the rocks and brush. His shots were precise, methodical, each one serving a purpose. A bullet here to spook a horse, another there to disarm a gunman. He wasn't just fighting, he was conducting an orchestra of chaos with surgical precision. "Fall back," Mason finally ordered, realizing the trap they'd ridden into. "Regroup at the ridge." But retreat proved as deadly as advance. Kane had prepared for this too. As the gang members turned their horses, they found their escape routes compromised. More traps sprung. More precisely placed shots herded them exactly where Kane wanted them. The gang's morale broke. Hardened outlaws who'd faced down posses and armies now found themselves facing something they couldn't understand. A force of nature wearing a black duster. One by one, then in groups, they threw down their weapons. Only the Blackwood brothers remained defiant. James tried to use his sharpshooting skills, setting up for a long-distance shot, but Kane seemed to materialize out of nowhere behind him. The Winchester was kicked from his hands before he could fire. The twins made one last coordinated attack, but their perfect symmetry was their undoing. Kane's response was lightning fast. 2 shots, so close together they sounded like one. Each twin found his gun hand disabled with identical wounds. Mason Blackwood, watching his fearsome gang surrender to a single man, finally snapped. With a roar of rage, he charged straight at Kane, guns blazing in both hands. It was a spectacular display of firepower, and entirely futile. Kane's final draw was something witnesses would talk about for decades. The pearl-handled Remington seemed to materialize in his hand faster than the eye could follow. One shot, precise and perfect, sent Mason's primary gun spinning away. A second shot did the same to his backup weapon. The legendary outlaw found himself standing disarmed, facing the man they called Lightning. In that moment, Mason Blackwood understood why 23 men had fallen to this quiet rancher. It wasn't just speed or skill, it was the calculated precision of a man who had turned vengeance into an art form. "You could have killed us all," Mason realized, looking around at his wounded but living men. "Why didn't you?" Kane's response was characteristically quiet. "Because I'm not what you are. Never was. Even during Madison County, every man I killed had a choice. They chose wrong." He holstered his Remington with fluid grace. "I gave you the same choice today. You chose wrong." As Sheriff Cooper and Marshal Reed moved in to make arrests, the sun finally crested the valley walls fully, painting the scene in golden light. The legend of Lightning Kane had just added another chapter, but this one was different. This time, he'd won not just through speed and skill, but through mercy and justice. Thunder Valley would never be the same. In the days following the Blackwood gang's defeat, Thunder Valley underwent a transformation as profound as the morning after a cleansing storm. The legend of Lightning Kane grew, but it was different now, not just a tale of vengeance and speed, but one of justice tempered with mercy. Before we wrap up this incredible story, make sure you're subscribed to catch more legendary tales of the Old West. The town jail had never been so full. Sheriff Cooper and Marshal Reed spent 3 days processing prisoners, taking statements, and sending telegrams to various territories where the Blackwoods had outstanding warrants. The 4 brothers were kept separate from their men, each coming to terms with their defeat in their own way. Mason Blackwood, perhaps, underwent the most striking change. On his 3rd day in custody, he asked to speak with Kane. The quiet rancher arrived at dawn, standing outside the cell with characteristic stillness. "I've spent my whole life building a reputation on fear," Mason said, his voice stripped of its former arrogance. "Thought that was what made a man powerful. But you did more damage to my reputation by letting us live than you ever could have by killing us." Kane's response was typically succinct. "Fear fades. Honor lasts." The impact of the battle rippled far beyond Thunder Valley's borders. Word spread quickly through the territories, not just of how one man had defeated 30, but of how he'd done it. No unnecessary deaths, no excessive force, just precise tactical brilliance coupled with almost supernatural skill. Dr. Bennett found himself treating the wounded with a new appreciation for Kane's precision. Every wound placed exactly where it would disable, but not permanently maim, he explained to Sarah Martinez. The kind of skill that takes more control than killing. Maria Flores' store became a gathering point for sharing stories. Each townsperson had their own perspective on the battle, their own moment when they realized they were watching history unfold. Piano Jack swore he'd compose a ballad about it, though he admitted no tune could quite capture the speed of Lightning Kane's draw. The town itself began to change. New settlers arrived, drawn by the story of a place where justice prevailed over tyranny. The railroad, which had long bypassed Thunder Valley, suddenly showed renewed interest in running a spur line through. Progress, it seemed, followed in the wake of peace. Kane himself remained largely unchanged by his victory. He still made his Thursday supply runs, still spoke softly when he spoke at all. But there were subtle differences. He began teaching young Deputy Taylor the finer points of shooting, though he never demonstrated his full speed. Sometimes in the evening, he could be seen sharing quiet conversations with Marshal Reed on the sheriff's porch. One evening, about a week after the battle, Sarah Martinez found the courage to ask him directly, "Why did you choose our town? Of all the places you could have settled, why here?" Kane was silent for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the valley walls in shades of gold and crimson. "After Madison County," he finally said, "I carried darkness with me, went from place to place, looking for something I couldn't name." He gestured at the peaceful valley. "Found it here, a place worth protecting, people worth standing for." The Blackwood brothers were eventually transferred to the territorial prison, their gang disbanded. But before they left, Mason Blackwood made a prediction that would prove prophetic. "Mark my words," he told Sheriff Cooper, "what happened here will change things. When word spreads that Lightning Kane showed mercy to the Blackwood gang, other men might start thinking differently about the kind of reputation worth having." He wasn't wrong. Over the following months, several notorious outlaws passed through Thunder Valley, but instead of bringing trouble, they sought out Kane, not for gunfights, but for guidance. Quick Draw McGraw, who had chosen to stay in town, often remarked that Kane had started something bigger than himself, a legend not of fear, but of redemption. The pearl-handled Remington remained at Kane's side, but it was drawn less and less frequently. Its owner had found something he'd lost after Madison County, not just peace, but purpose. The lightning still dwelt within him, but now it protected rather than destroyed. Thunder Valley flourished under its quiet guardian's watch. The story of Lightning Kane evolved from a tale of vengeance to one of transformation, both of a man and a town that had given him reason to holster his gun more often than draw it. If this story touched your heart, remember to subscribe. There are more tales of justice, redemption, and courage coming your way. Years later, when asked about the legend of Lightning Kane, Marshal Reed would simply smile and say, "Some men choose to make their mark with noise and fury. Others, like lightning, remind us that the most powerful forces in nature can come wrapped in quiet packages." The quiet rancher still rides his daily rounds in Thunder Valley, the pearl-handled Remington at his side, more a symbol now than a weapon. They say on clear nights, when the stars shine bright over Texas, you can still find him on his porch, watching over the town that helped a legend find his peace. For in the end, the greatest victory of Lightning Kane wasn't the day he faced down 30 men. It was every day after, when he chose to be not just a legend, but a guardian, proving that even the deadliest lightning can become life-giving rain when it chooses to nurture rather than destroy. 2 months after the Blackwood Gang's defeat, autumn painted Thunder Valley in shades of gold and amber. The town had settled into a new rhythm, prosperity following in the wake of peace. But as any frontier veteran could tell you, peace in the territories was as delicate as morning frost. If you've been following this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's always more history waiting to be told. The first warning came through the telegraph office. Sarah Martinez was working the afternoon shift when the message arrived from El Paso. Her hands trembled as she decoded the words. Cortez brothers heading north. 20 riders. Seeking lightning. Stop. Exercise caution. Stop. The Cortez brothers were different from the Blackwoods. Where Mason Blackwood had built his reputation on fear and intimidation, the Cortezes were professional manhunters. 3 Mexican aristocrats turned bounty killers. They had made their fortune tracking down legends and putting them in the ground. Their reputation was built not on random violence, but on methodical, calculated elimination of the West's most dangerous men. Sheriff Cooper found Kane at his ranch, mending fences in the late autumn sun. "They're professionals," Cooper warned after delivering the news. "Not common bandits. They've killed 12 famous gunmen in the past year alone." Kane continued his work, his movements unhurried. 13, he corrected quietly. "They killed Tom Deadeye Wilson last week in Yuma. News hasn't reached here yet." The correction sent a chill down Cooper's spine. Kane had been keeping track, preparing even before they turned their sights on him. The quiet rancher had known they would come eventually. Lightning, it seemed, had a way of drawing storms. Word of the Cortez brothers' approach spread through town like wildfire. Unlike the Blackwoods, whose reputation inspired fear, the Cortezes drew a different kind of attention. Professional gunmen began arriving in Thunder Valley, not to challenge Kane, but to witness what they believed would be a historic confrontation. Maria Flores noticed the subtle changes in Kane's behavior. His weekly supply runs now included items that spoke of preparation, extra ammunition, gun oil, and materials for wound treatment. "You don't have to face them alone," she told him one morning. "The town stands with you." Kane's response was characteristically measured. "They're not coming for the town, they're coming for the legend." Marshal Reed, who had chosen to extend his stay in Thunder Valley indefinitely, understood better than most what was coming. "The Cortezes are students of their targets," he explained to Cooper during a strategy session. "They'll have studied every story, every account of how Kane fights. They won't make the Blackwoods' mistakes." Dr. Bennett, remembering the precision of Kane's shots during the Blackwood fight, raised an interesting point. "Perhaps that's why he didn't kill any of them," the doctor mused. "He knew others would be watching, learning, kept some tricks in reserve." The theory gained weight when Quickdraw McGrath shared a revelation. "Been watching him practice at dawn," the reformed gunslinger told them. "What we saw against the Blackwoods, that wasn't his full speed, not even close." As October drew to a close, the tension in Thunder Valley reached a fever pitch. The Cortez brothers were reported to be less than 2 days' ride away. Their reputation preceded them. Alejandro, the eldest, was a master strategist who had never lost a campaign. Miguel, the middle brother, was said to be as fast as Lightning Kane himself, and Ramon, the youngest, was a prodigy with a rifle who could hit a playing card at 400 yards. Kane spent these days in careful preparation, but not in the same way he had for the Blackwoods. There were no elaborate traps this time, no tactical arrangements of mirrors and tripwires. Instead, he rode the boundaries of his property at dawn and dusk, as if memorizing every shadow, every patch of ground. Sarah Martinez, bringing him news of another telegraph, found him standing on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the valley walls. "They say you can't beat them," she said softly, "that no one ever has." Kane's response was typical in its simplicity, yet held depths of meaning. "Everything that lives can die," he said quietly. "Everything that hunts can be hunted." The words sent a shiver through those who heard them. This wasn't the same man who had faced down the Blackwoods with tactical brilliance and mercy. This was Lightning Kane of the Madison County War, the avenger who had hunted 23 men to their graves. The town prepared as best it could. Cooper organized volunteers, Reed established lookout points, and McGraw drilled anyone willing to learn in basic gunfighting. But everyone knew that when the Cortez brothers arrived, it would come down to a personal reckoning. Thunder Valley held its breath, waiting for the approaching storm. The legend of Lightning Kane was about to be tested in a way it never had before, not against common bandits or notorious outlaws, but against men who had made a science of killing legends. And as the autumn wind whispered through the valley, carrying rumors of approaching hoofbeats, Michael Lightning Kane stood on his porch, the pearl-handled Remington at his side, ready to prove once again why some legends survive while others fade into dust. Be sure to subscribe for the next chapter in this epic tale of the Old West, where legends meet their match and lightning strikes twice. The Cortez brothers arrived in Thunder Valley with the first winter storm, their approach masked by swirling snow and gathering darkness. Unlike the Blackwoods' brazen entrance, they came with the quiet precision that had made them famous. No grand announcements, no shows of force, just 3 riders emerging from the storm like wraiths, their 20 followers maintaining a discreet distance. If you're enjoying this tale of legendary gunslingers, make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories of the Old West. Alejandro Cortez, the eldest, cut an impressive figure as he rode down Thunder Valley's main street. His black Andalusian stallion moved with the same controlled grace as its rider, each step measured and deliberate. Miguel, riding at his right, carried himself with the coiled tension of a rattlesnake about to strike. Ramon, the youngest, seemed almost bored, but his eyes constantly scanned rooflines and windows with predatory focus. Sheriff Cooper and Marshal Reed watched their approach from the jail's porch. "Different breed entirely," Reed muttered. "Look how they move, scanning sectors, maintaining spacing. These aren't bandits, they're hunters." The brothers dismounted outside the Silver Dollar Saloon with fluid efficiency, their movements synchronized from years of working together. No weapons were drawn, no threats made. They simply entered the establishment as if they owned it, ordered drinks, and took a corner table with their backs to the wall. It was Piano Jack who first broke the tension, his weathered hands trembling slightly on his glass. "Heard you gentlemen have quite a reputation," he ventured. Alejandro Cortez smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "We prefer to think of it as a professional record," he replied, his accent cultured and refined. 12 legendary gunmen in the past year alone. Each one thought himself immortal, each one learned otherwise. 13, Miguel corrected softly. "Don't forget Wilson in Yuma." The correction sent a chill through the saloon. They were the exact words Kane had used days earlier. The hunters and their prey had been tracking each other all along. Quick-draw McGraw, watching from the bar, noticed details others missed. The way Miguel's right hand never strayed far from his gun, the subtle adjustments Ramon made to keep sightlines clear, the way Alejandro positioned himself to monitor the entire room. These men hadn't just studied Kane, they'd studied every man who'd ever faced him. Sarah Martinez arrived with a telegram, her entrance causing all three brothers to shift slightly, maintaining their tactical advantage. The message was simple. Army patrol delayed by storm. Stop. No reinforcements for at least 3 days. Stop. The news seemed to please Alejandro. Perfect, he murmured. No distractions. It was then that Michael Kane entered the saloon, his black duster dusted with snow, moving with that liquid grace that had become legendary. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Here were two opposing forces of nature, the lightning that struck without warning, and the hunters who had made a science of catching lightning in a bottle. "Senor Kane," Alejandro rose, offering a small bow. "Your reputation does you justice. The way you handled the Blackwood situation? Magnificent, professional, almost artistic." Kane said nothing, those quiet eyes taking in every detail of his opponents. "We've studied you, you know," Miguel added, his hand casually near his gun. "Every account, every witness statement, every trick and tactic, the mirrors at Madison County, the tripwires in Apache Wells, the way you used the sun against the Carson gang. Even your mercy," Ramon chimed in, his young face alive with intellectual curiosity. "The precise wound placement, the psychological warfare, truly masterful." "But that's the thing about studying a legend," Alejandro continued, his voice taking on an almost professorial tone. "Eventually you learn that every legend has its limits. Every technique can be countered. Every strategy can be turned against itself." Kane's response was characteristically minimal. "You're not the first to think so." "No," Alejandro agreed, "but we'll be the last. You see, the others, the Blackwoods, the Carson gang, all of them, they tried to beat you at your own game. We're here to change the game entirely." The threat was delivered with the same cultured politeness as everything else, making it somehow more chilling. These weren't men driven by ego or bravado. They were professionals discussing business. 24 hours, Alejandro announced, finishing his drink. "Professional courtesy. Time to set your affairs in order. Say your goodbyes. Tomorrow at sunset, we finish this." As they rose to leave, Miguel paused. "One question, if you'll indulge me. The Blackwoods. Why let them live? It wasn't mercy, was it? You were hiding something, keeping some tricks in reserve." The ghost of a smile touched Kane's lips. "Guess you'll find out." The brothers departed as quietly as they had arrived, leaving the saloon in stunned silence. Marshal Reed was the first to speak. "They're right about one thing," he said grimly. "This won't be like the Blackwoods. These men won't fall for traps or tricks." Kane nodded slightly. "No tricks this time. No traps." "Then how?" Cooper began. "Sometimes," Kane interrupted softly, "the best trick is making them look for tricks that aren't there." The next 24 hours in Thunder Valley passed like a held breath. The storm intensified, blanketing the valley in white, turning familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes. The Cortez brothers and their men made camp just outside town, their fires visible through the swirling snow like predators' eyes in the dark. Kane spent the time in quiet preparation, though not in the way anyone expected. There were no elaborate defensive preparations, no tactical arrangements. Instead, he sat on his porch watching the storm, the pearl-handled Remington resting in his lap as if it were simply a part of him. "They think they've figured you out," Sarah told him, bringing him coffee late that evening. "They think they know all your secrets." Kane's response was barely audible above the winter wind. "Then they've already lost." As sunset approached the next day, Thunder Valley prepared for another legend in the making. But this time, everyone knew it would be different. This wasn't just a battle between good and evil or law and chaos. This was a collision between two forces of nature, the unstoppable lightning and the immovable hunters who had made a career of bottling storms. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be whispered about in saloons across the territory for decades to come. Lightning was about to strike again, but this time the thunder would shake the very foundations of legend itself. The day of reckoning dawned white and silent, the storm having blanketed Thunder Valley in a pristine sheet of snow. As sunset approached, the clouds parted just enough to paint the landscape in shades of blood and gold, nature itself setting the stage for the coming confrontation. If you've enjoyed this epic tale, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got more legendary stories coming your way. The Cortez brothers arrived exactly at the appointed time, their precision evident even in this. They positioned themselves in the town's main street with tactical perfection, Alejandro in the center, Miguel and Ramon flanking him at carefully calculated distances. Their 20 men spread out in a precise pattern, each position chosen to eliminate any possible advantage Kane might have planned. "They're not just good," Marshal Reed observed grimly from his position near the jail. "They're perfect. Too perfect." Kane emerged from the gathering shadows like a ghost, his black duster untouched by the snow, the pearl-handled Remington riding easy on his hip. He moved with that liquid grace that had become legendary, each step deliberate and measured. "No tricks this time," Alejandro called out, his cultured voice carrying across the silent street. "No elaborate traps, no tactical brilliance, just skill against skill, speed against speed." Kane's response was characteristically quiet. "You still don't understand." "Oh, but we do," Miguel countered, his hand hovering near his gun. "We've studied every move you've ever made, every technique you've ever used. We know you better than you know yourself." A ghost of a smile touched Kane's lips. "That's your first mistake." The tension stretched like pulled leather. Every window, every doorway held watching eyes. This wasn't just a gunfight. It was history in the making, legend meeting its match. Ramon, the youngest, made the first move. His rifle came up with blinding speed, aimed at where Kane stood. But Kane wasn't there anymore. He moved like his namesake, faster than the eye could follow. The pearl-handled Remington spoke once, and Ramon's rifle went spinning away, its barrel split by a precisely placed shot. Miguel drew next, his speed living up to his reputation. His bullet passed through the space Kane had occupied a heartbeat before. Kane's return shot caught him in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. "Impossible," Miguel gasped, clutching his wound. "No one's that fast." "Your second mistake," Kane said softly, "was thinking speed was what made me dangerous." Alejandro, watching his brothers fall, showed no emotion. "Interesting," he mused. "You're actually faster than the stories say. You've been holding back all these years." The remaining gunman began to move, but Alejandro raised his hand. "No, this is between us now, professional courtesy." What followed would be talked about in whispers for decades to come. Alejandro Cortez, the man who had made a science of killing legends, drew his gun with practiced perfection. His technique was flawless, his speed supernatural, his accuracy legendary. But Kane moved like light itself. The pearl-handled Remington seemed to materialize in his hand between one heartbeat and the next. Both guns roared in the gathering darkness. When the smoke cleared, Alejandro stood motionless, his gun hanging limply from his fingers. A neat hole had been drilled through his weapon's cylinder, rendering it useless. "Your final mistake," Kane said into the stunned silence, "was believing that legends are made of techniques and tactics. They're not. They're made of the things that can't be studied or learned." Alejandro looked at his ruined gun with something approaching wonder. "All this time," he breathed, "you weren't just holding back against the others. You were holding back against yourself." The lightning, Kane replied softly. Strikes where it needs to, not where men expect it to. The remaining gunmen, seeing their invincible leaders defeated, began to back away. But Kane wasn't finished. The pearl-handled Remington moved again, too fast to see, its report echoing like thunder. When the echo faded, 20 men found themselves disarmed, their weapons disabled with surgical precision. It wasn't about speed, Marshal Reed realized, watching in amazement. It was never about speed. It was about choosing when not to be fast. The Cortez brothers, for the first time in their professional careers, found themselves on the other side of legend. Their scientific approach to killing, their perfect techniques, their flawless strategies, all had crumbled in the face of something they couldn't quantify or predict. "Why let us live?" Alejandro asked, as Cooper and Reed began making arrests. "You could have ended it all with 3 shots. Kane holstered his Remington with fluid grace, because sometimes the greatest power isn't in taking life, it's in choosing to spare it. The legend of Lightning Kane changed that day. The stories that spread across the territories weren't just about his speed or his accuracy. They were about the day he faced the deadliest manhunters in the West and chose to make them witnesses rather than victims. Thunder Valley changed too. No more would-be legends came seeking to make their names. No more gangs tried to test their strength against its quiet guardian. The town grew and prospered under the protection of a man who had proven that true strength lies not in how fast you can draw, but in knowing when to keep your gun holstered. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe because we've got more incredible tales of the Old West coming your way. Years later, when asked about that snowy evening, Piano Jack would always smile and say, "You know what the really amazing thing was? After all that speed, all that lightning, he never once broke his silence, never raised his voice, just stood there in the snow, quiet as ever, letting his actions speak louder than any words could." Michael, Lightning. Kane continued his quiet life in Thunder Valley, the pearl-handled Remington always at his side, but rarely drawn. They say on winter evenings, you can still find him on his porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and crimson. For in the end, the greatest legends aren't made in moments of violence and thunder. They're made in the quiet moments between the storms, when a man chooses mercy over vengeance, peace over power, and finds that true strength lies not in the lightning strike, but in the wisdom to keep it contained. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this story touched your heart. There are more legends waiting to be told.